Snow fell thick and silent over Winterbourne Manor, muffling the world as though the house itself held its breath. Inside the library, firelight danced upon mahogany and Morocco leather, yet failed to warm the figure sprawled across the Persian rug. Sir Reginald Armitage lay on his back, arms flung wide like a crucifix, a Burmese dagger buried to its jade hilt beneath his sternum. Blood had soaked into the priceless carpet in a near-perfect circle, black in the firelight. One hand still clutched a broken length of golden cord. Upon the mantel, the glass case that had housed the legendary Armitage Christmas ornament, a jade tree heavy with Burmese rubies, stood empty. Chapter 1. The Summons in the Snow. The snow began at dusk on the 23rd of December, 1935, soft as swan's down at first, then thicker, heavier, until it seemed the sky itself had decided to bury Winterbourne Manor and all its secrets beneath a shroud of immaculate white. By midnight, the wind had risen, moaning around the eaves like a mourning woman driving the flakes against the tall windows of the library where Sir Reginald Armitage sat alone, a decanter of whiskey at his elbow, and a look of sour triumph on his weathered face. He had dismissed his secretary more than an hour earlier, almost brusquely, and told the butler that he wished to be disturbed by no one, not his brother, not his sister-in-law, not the house guests who had arrived that afternoon in a flurry of laughter and expensive furs. He had work to finish, he said, and the tone implied that the work was more important than Christmas, more important than family, more important than anything that breathed. So the house settled into uneasy quiet, fires banked low, clocks ticking toward an appointment none of them yet understood. At 20 minutes past 3, the library door opened without a sound. A figure slipped inside, closing the door with the same silence, and stood for a moment outlined against the dying glow of the fire. Sir Reginald did not look up at once. He was writing, the nib of his fountain pen scratching across heavy cream paper. And when he did raise his head, his expression changed only once. Surprise, swiftly followed by recognition, and then, curiously, by something that might almost have been relief. He laid down the pen. He said a name, softly, almost tenderly, and rose from his chair. The figure moved forward. There was no cry, no struggle, only the faintest intake of breath as the antique Burmese dagger, taken down from its place above the mantel, slid between the fourth and fifth ribs with the precision of long practice. Sir Reginald's knees buckled. He sank back into his leather armchair, one hand clutching at the jade hilt, the other reaching blindly toward the broken length of golden cord that had fallen across the desk. His eyes remained open, fixed upon his killer with that same expression of astonished recognition, until the light behind them guttered out. The murderer worked, quickly then. The glass case that housed the famous Armitage ornament, the jade Christmas tree heavy with Burmese rubies, was unlocked with a key taken from Sir Reginald's own waistcoat pocket. The ornament itself, no larger than a man's fist yet worth a Raja's ransom, was lifted out, wrapped in a square of black silk produced from a pocket, and vanished into the folds of a dark coat. The key was returned to the dead man's pocket, the glass door left ajar exactly as Sir Reginald might have left it himself. Finally, the golden cord, severed by the same dagger that had killed him, was pressed into the slack fingers so that it appeared the victim had tried to defend himself against a thief. A single drop of blood had fallen upon the Persian rug. It was blotted carefully with a handkerchief that was then consigned to the fire. The flames flared briefly, consuming the evidence, and when they sank again, the library looked almost peaceful. Merely an old man asleep in his chair after too much whiskey, a case standing open, a priceless jewel gone. The murderer paused only once, to glance toward the tall windows where snow still beat soundlessly against the panes, and then slipped out as silently as he, or she, had entered. By 6:30, the housemaid Ellen, a raw-boned girl from the village who had been promised double pay to stay over the holiday, tapped timidly at the library door with Sir Reginald's morning tea. There was no answer. She tapped again, louder, then turned the handle and peered inside. The scream that followed brought the entire household running in various states of undress and alarm. Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, reached the library first, took one look at her master's body and the blood-soaked rug, and proved herself a woman of iron by closing the door firmly in the faces of the curious before allowing anyone else to enter. She sent the under-butler telephoning for the police and instructed that no one was to leave the house or touch anything in the library until the authorities arrived. Then, and only then, did she permit herself to sit down upon the bottom stair and press a hand to her heart, as though to still its frantic beating. Word reached the village constable by 7:15, and he, poor man, took one look at the scene and telephoned his superiors in Oxford. By 8 o'clock, Inspector Marsh was plowing through the snow in a police Bentley, swearing steadily under his breath, for he had met Sir Reginald Armitage on several occasions and had never cared for the man. But murder was murder, and Christmas was ruined for everyone. By 9, the house was surrounded by constables attempting to look efficient while slipping on the ice, and the 5 house guests plus the colonel and his wife were gathered in the drawing room under the eye of a young sergeant who clearly wished himself anywhere else on earth. It was at this point that Mrs. Dalrymple, after a whispered consultation with Lady Armitage, who was not yet Lady Armitage but would have been had Sir Reginald lived another fortnight, remembered that one of the greatest detectives in Europe was spending the festive season only 5 miles away at the King's Arms in Lesser Winterbourne, having been invited there by a former client who bred prize Sealyhams. The telephone lines were cruelly burdened that morning, but the call went through, and at 23 minutes past 10, Hercule Poirot, wrapped in 3 pullovers, 2 scarves, and an expression of acute suffering, was informed that his presence was requested at a house where murder had been committed. "But naturally," he murmured into the receiver, "one does not refuse when murder is served with the Christmas goose. Tell them Poirot comes." He arrived at Winterbourne Manor just before noon, the Armstrong Siddeley limousine skidding elegantly to a halt before the front steps while footmen and policemen alike scrambled to open the door against the wind. Poirot emerged like a small black beetle from its chrysalis, his galoshes gleaming, his moustaches bristling with indignation at the cold. Inspector Marsh hurried forward, rubbing reddened hands. "Thank God you're here, Monsieur Poirot. It's a rum one. Locked room, no footprints in the snow, priceless jewel missing, and a house full of people who all hated the dead man's guts." Poirot raised one eyebrow. "Hated, you say? Already you interest me profoundly." They entered the hall together, Marsh talking rapidly, Poirot listening with his head cocked to one side like a bright, inquisitive bird. The great Christmas tree reached almost to the minstrel gallery, half decorated, its topmost branches bare and forlorn. Servants scurried about with averted faces. From the drawing-room came the low murmur of strained voices. Poirot paused on the threshold of the library and for a long moment simply looked, the body now covered decorously with a dust sheet, the empty glass case, the blood that had soaked deep into ancient silk, the dagger with its wicked curved blade still protruding from beneath the sheet like an accusation. "Précisément," he said at last, softly. "A crime of passion committed with the coldness of perfect calculation. Observe, my friend, the angle of the wound. The killer stood above him, here." He positioned himself beside the chair and struck downward with the right hand. Yet Sir Reginald was seated writing. He did not rise in alarm. He knew his murderer, trusted him, or her, sufficiently to remain seated while death approached. Marsh shivered, though the room was warm. The doors were locked, the windows fastened, no tracks in the snow outside any of them. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then we have the locked room à la mode. Delicious." He moved to the desk, gloved fingers hovering but not quite touching the scattered pages of the memoir. And these words he was writing, see how the pen is dug deep into the paper at the final stroke. Rage, yes, but also fear. He understood at the last moment that he had miscalculated badly. A slight sound made both men turn. In the doorway stood a young woman, perhaps 25, dressed in dove-gray wool with a collar of white lace at her throat. Her face was very pale, her eyes red-rimmed, yet there was about her a composure that struck Poirot at once as both fragile and dangerous. She carried a small notebook clutched against her chest as though it were armor. "Miss Green," said Marsh heavily. "Sir Reginald's secretary." Felicity Green inclined her head with the ghost of a curtsy. "Inspector, I came to see if there was anything I could— That is, Her voice faltered. Poirot studied her with sudden, intense concentration. "You were working late with Sir Reginald last evening, mademoiselle?" "Until 11:30, she answered steadily. "He was dictating revisions to the Burmese chapters. Then he said he had a private appointment and dismissed me." "Dismissed," Poirot repeated, savoring the word. "A hard word from an employer to one who has served faithfully. You were hurt, perhaps?" A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "I was surprised, that is all." "And this private appointment, he gave no name?" "None." Poirot's gaze traveled slowly over her face, her hands, the notebook she still held so tightly. "You are from Burma originally, I think. The coloring, the bone structure, and the scent you wear. Frangipani, is it not? One does not find that perfume easily in England." For the first time she looked directly at him, and in her dark eyes something flickered. Anger, fear, grief, he could not tell which. "My mother was Burmese," she said quietly. "Sir Reginald knew that when he engaged me." "Ah," Poirot's smile was gentle, terrible. "Then you and he had much to discuss, n'est-ce pas? Old times, old loyalties, old betrayals." Her fingers tightened on the notebook until the knuckles showed white. "Come, Inspector," Poirot said briskly, turning away. "We have much to do. The little gray cells, they begin to stir. But first," he glanced back at the girl, "first, mademoiselle, you will oblige me by remaining within call. I think we shall have need of you again before this day is ended." Felicity Green said nothing. She only inclined her head once more and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. But Poirot, listening, heard the faintest catch of breath that might have been a sob, or might have been the sound of someone who has just seen the first link in the chain that will hang them forged before their eyes. Outside the library windows the snow continued to fall, thick and silent and pitiless, erasing every trace of what had passed in the night. Inside, Hercule Poirot removed his gloves, rubbed his hands together, and prepared to set about the business of discovering which of the 5 people trapped in this house with a corpse had hated Sir Reginald Armitage enough, and loved something else far more, to drive a dagger through his heart on the eve of Christmas. Chapter 2. The 5 Who Remained. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon the snow had eased into a glittering stillness, and the drawing room at Winterbourne Manor looked like a stage set for a tragedy in the Russian style. Crimson walls, heavy gold fringes on the curtains, of fire roaring up the chimney, and 5 people arranged about the room in attitudes of barely suppressed violence, each trying to appear more innocent than the next while suspicion crawled over them like frost. Poirot entered without ceremony, divesting himself of his immense fur coat into the arms of a hovering footman, and surveyed the company with the bright, almost childlike curiosity that so often disarmed the guilty. Inspector Marsh followed, notebook in hand, looking as though he would have preferred to be directing traffic in Piccadilly Circus. Poirot rubbed his small hands together, gave a tiny bow that included everyone and no one, and began to speak in that soft, precise voice that somehow carried to the furthest corner. Mesdames, messieurs, we are all reasonable people, yes? We find ourselves imprisoned, temporarily one trusts, by the snow and by a crime most disturbing. Sir Reginald Armitage is dead, stabbed once through the heart with his own dagger, and a priceless jade ornament has vanished as completely as though the earth opened and swallowed it. The doors were locked, the windows fastened, the snow outside bears no footprint. Therefore, the murderer is here in this room, and the ornament also, unless it has already been posted to Antwerp in a brown paper parcel, which I assure you it has not. He paused, smiling kindly. Hercule Poirot dislikes coincidences, and there are already far too many for comfort. Colonel Armitage, florid and choleric, half rose from his chair, mustache bristling like a badger disturbed in its set. "Damned impudence! Are you accusing a man in his own house?" His voice was a parade ground bark that had terrified subalterns from Peshawar to Mandalay. But Poirot merely lifted one eyebrow, and the colonel subsided, growling into his whiskey. "Accuse? No, mon colonel, I observe. I observe, for example, that you quarreled violently with your brother only last week. The servants heard you threaten to shoot him if he did not advance you £20,000 against the expected sale of the jade ornament. You said, correct me if memory plays tricks, that you would rather see him dead than ruined by his own obstinacy. Strong words, even between brothers." The colonel's face turned the color of a boiled lobster. "Family quarrel, nothing more. Reggie knew I never meant—" "Yet here he lies, very dead indeed," Poirot murmured. He turned to Lavinia Armitage, who sat upon a brocade sofa, twisting a diamond bracelet round and round her wrist until the stones flashed like angry eyes. She was 35, beautiful in the overripe fashion of women who have married money and discovered too late that money cannot buy back youth. "Madame, you also had words with Sir Reginald. He had promised to make you a handsome settlement upon your marriage to the colonel, then changed his mind when he learned of certain indiscretions in London last summer. One understands he threatened exposure unless you persuaded your husband to moderate his demands." Lavinia's laugh was thin and metallic. "Reginald always threatened exposure. It was his favorite pastime. I was tired of it, yes, but I did not stick a knife in him for it. Besides, I was playing bridge with Major Blake until 2 in the morning. Ask him." Major Desmond Blake stood by the window, a tall, gaunt man with the rigid spine of the old Indian Army and eyes that had seen too many things best forgotten. He turned slowly, the scar along his jaw livid against sunburnt skin. "Mrs. Armitage is correct. We played until the fire burned low. Then I went to my room." Poirot's gaze rested upon him thoughtfully. "Yet you knew this house well in former days, Major. You dined here often when Sir Reginald was your commanding officer in Burma. You knew exactly where the dagger hung and where the key to the glass case was kept. And you have never forgiven Sir Reginald for the court-martial of your friend Captain Green in 1911. A court-martial many believed unjust." Blake's lips thinned. "I came this Christmas to ask, only to ask, that the ornament be returned to the temple from which it was taken. I had no need to murder for it." "Perhaps," Poirot said softly. "Perhaps not." His attention shifted to the last of the guests. Giles Armitage, 28, handsome in the weak-chinned English fashion, lounged in an armchair with one leg over the arm and a cigarette dangling from negligent fingers. His evening clothes from the night before were rumpled. He had clearly slept in them, or not slept at all. "Dear uncle was cutting me off without a shilling," he offered before Poirot could speak. 14,000 reasons at White's alone. But I'm not the murderous sort, Monsieur Poirot. I prefer to let other people do my killing for me. Bookmakers, runners mostly." He smiled, and it was not pleasant. "Besides, I was dead drunk by midnight. Felicity had to help me up the stairs." At the mention of her name, every head turned toward the doorway where Miss Felicity Green stood quietly, hands folded, the perfect secretary even in tragedy. Her eyes met Poirot's for a moment and slid away. "You confirm this, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked. "I put Mr. Giles to bed at 12:15, she said in her low, precise voice. "He was incapable of violence by then. And after that, I went to my own room. I read for perhaps half an hour and then slept." Poirot nodded slowly as though satisfied, though his eyes never left her face. "5 persons," he repeated almost to himself. 5 persons who hated Sir Reginald for 5 excellent reasons, and one of them hated enough to kill. The house was locked, the snow fell without cease. Yet between midnight and 6 o'clock, death walked these corridors as silently as Father Christmas himself, and left no trace but a dead man and an empty case. He moved to the great Christmas tree that dominated one corner of the room, its lower branches glittering with glass and silver, its upper reaches still bare. Tomorrow was to have been the ceremony of the jade ornament, he said. Sir Reginald would mount the library steps, the household assembled, and the jewel would be hung at the very top as it has been every Christmas for 25 years. A pretty ritual, yes? Yet tonight the ornament is gone, and Sir Reginald will never climb those steps again. Colonel Armitage made a choking sound. Lavinia began to cry noisily into a lace handkerchief. Major Blake stared out at the white gardens as though he saw ghosts marching across the snow. Giles lit another cigarette with fingers that trembled only slightly. And Felicity Green stood motionless, her face as pale and perfect as the snow itself. Poirot clapped his hands once, softly. "Come, my friends, let us begin. Somewhere in this house is a jewel worth a fortune, and somewhere in one of these hearts is a murder. The snow keeps us all prisoners until the truth is found, and Hercule Poirot has never yet failed to discover the truth. Shall we see who blinks first?" Chapter 3. Footprints that were not there. Poirot left the drawing room with the satisfied air of a man who has just stirred a hornet's nest and now intends to watch the hornets fly. He descended the great oak staircase past suits of armor that had stood sentinel since the days of Charles II, and stepped out through the garden door into the blinding white world beyond. The cold struck him like a slap, but he merely turned up the collar of his immense coat, drew on a pair of fur-lined gloves, and began his circuit of the house with the neat, deliberate steps of a clockwork toy. Inspector Marsh trailed behind, slipping on the packed ice and swearing under his breath, while 2 constables followed at a respectful distance carrying measuring tapes and cameras that looked absurdly modern against the Elizabethan brickwork. The library windows faced south, 3 tall casements set high in the wall, their sills a good 8 feet above the ground. Snow had drifted against the house in soft, sculptured waves, untouched except where the constable on duty had tramped a clumsy path that morning. Poirot knelt, peered, brushed the surface with a gloved finger, and gave a small exclamation of pleasure. The snow on every sill was smooth, wind-ruffled virgin. The brass catches inside gleamed with the dull patina of long disuse. He moved on to the adjacent windows, the gun room, the morning room, the conservatory, and found the same story repeated. No ladder marks, no disturbance, no sign that any human agency had passed that way since the snow began. When he reached the west front, he paused beneath the library again and looked upward, narrowing his eyes against the glare. The wall rose sheer, ivy frozen into black lace against the red brick, the guttering thick with icicles like jagged teeth. Impossible. Utterly impossible, and therefore, to Poirot, irresistible. He returned indoors, rubbing his hands, his nose pink but his eyes brilliant. In the hall he encountered Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, a gaunt woman in rustling black who had served the Armitage family for 40 years and looked as though she would serve them for 40 more even if they were all hanged. Poirot greeted her with old-world courtesy and asked to be shown the servants' passages. She led him behind the green baize door into a warren of narrow corridors lit by a single bulb, smelling of damp stone and carbolic. They passed the butler's pantry, the still room, the knife boy asleep on a stool, and finally reached a small iron-studded door that opened directly into the library. It was locked. Mrs. Dalrymple produced a key from the bunch at her waist, turned it and pushed. The door opened inward with a faint groan. "This door is kept locked always," she said in her flat North Country voice. "Sir Reginald's orders. Only he and I had keys." Poirot stepped through, looked about, and nodded. The door was concealed behind a tapestry of Salome dancing before Herod. From the library side, it was completely invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. He examined the lock, the hinges, the floorboards for scuffs. Nothing. He thanked Mrs. Dalrymple gravely, closed the door, and stood for a long moment in thought. Upstairs, in the long gallery that ran above the library, he discovered another curiosity. A Persian runner lay along the entire length of the floor, thick and priceless. Poirot walked its length slowly, eyes fixed upon the pile. Halfway along he stopped, bent, and with delicate fingers lifted something so small that Marsh, peering over his shoulder, could see nothing at all. "A thread," Poirot announced triumphantly. "Silk, black, caught upon the rough edge of the floorboard where the runner does not quite reach the wall. Someone passed this way in the night carrying something wrapped in black silk, and the thread snagged. Observe also the faint compression of the pile here and here again, very light, but the weight of a woman, I think." Marsh stared. "But the gallery doesn't connect to the library." "No, my friend, but there is a small staircase at the far end, a servant's stair that descends directly behind the tapestry. One could leave one's bedroom, descend unseen, enter the library, commit murder, and return the same way. All that was needed was a key to the iron door, and we know there were two." He led the way down the narrow stair, counting the steps aloud, and emerged behind the tapestry exactly where he expected. From there it was 3 paces to the desk where Sir Reginald had died. Poirot reconstructed the scene with gestures. The quiet opening of the door, the soft footfall across the rug, the sudden confrontation, the swift, downward blow. He acted it with such precision that Marsh felt the hairs rise on his neck. "Yet the ornament," Marsh objected. "Where is the ornament? We've searched every room, every cupboard, the attics, the cellars." Poirot's smile was seraphic. "Have you searched the Christmas tree, Inspector? The great tree in the hall that awaits its crown?" Marsh gaped. "You're joking." "I never joke about murder." They repaired at once to the entrance hall where the Norway spruce towered into shadow, its lower branches already laden with glittering baubles, but the top third still bare. A library ladder on brass wheels stood ready for the morrow's ceremony. Poirot mounted it himself, slowly, carefully, while half the household gathered below in varying degrees of astonishment and dread. At the very summit, wrapped in a scrap of black silk and tied with the remnant of the golden cord, hung the jade ornament, rubies catching the chandelier light like drops of fresh spilled blood. A single gasp rose from the watchers. Felicity Green went white as paper and put out a hand to the newel post as though she might fall. Colonel Armitage swore a great oath. Lavinia began to laugh, high and hysterical, until her husband shook her silent. Poirot descended with the jewel cradled in his hands as reverently as a priest with the host. He laid it upon the hall table and stood back. "Behold," he said softly, "the ornament restored, exactly where Sir Reginald would have placed it himself tomorrow had he lived. Someone, you perceive, was in a great hurry to complete the ritual, yet lacked the final touch of courage to hang it in full view of the household. Instead, they chose the secrecy of night, and the secrecy betrayed them. He looked around the circle of faces, guilt, fear, calculation, relief, and his eyes lingered longest on Felicity Green, who met his gaze for one burning moment before dropping her own. The footprints that were not there, Poirot murmured almost to himself, have led us directly to the heart of the matter. And the heart, mes amis, is a darker organ than even Hercule Poirot had suspected. Chapter 4. The Colonel's War. Poirot found Colonel Armitage in the gun-room shortly after the discovery of the ornament, standing amid the gleaming rows of Purdy's and Hollands as though he contemplated turning one upon himself or upon the world. The air was thick with the scent of gun oil and old leather, and the Colonel's face, lit by a single green-shaded lamp, looked carved from teak that had weathered too many monsoons. A half-empty glass of whiskey trembled in his hand. The decanter on the table was nearly done. He did not turn when Poirot entered, only stared at the mounted heads upon the wall. Tigers, leopards, a snarling black bear from Kashmir, as though seeking counsel from creatures that had died by his own rifle 40 years earlier. "You have come to arrest me, I suppose," he said at last, voice rough as broken coral. "Get on with it, then. I killed the bastard, everyone knows it. Might as well have signed my name in blood on the rug." Poirot closed the door softly, leaned his small, neat person against it, and regarded the Colonel with the mild curiosity he might bestow upon a curious insect. "Mon Colonel, you interest me enormously. You announce your guilt with the enthusiasm of a man ordering a second helping of roast beef. Yet murderers, in my experience, are rarely so obliging. Tell me, if you please, exactly how you accomplished this miracle of entering a locked library, stabbing your brother, removing the ornament, concealing it in the Christmas tree, and returning to your bed without leaving a single footprint in the snow. I am, as you see, all attention." The Colonel's shoulders sagged. He set the glass down with exaggerated care as though it might explode. "Don't be clever with me, Monsieur Poirot. I was drunk, blind drunk. I remember quarreling with Reggie at dinner, remember threatening him over the port, remember Lavinia laughing when I said I'd see him in hell first. After that, nothing. I woke in my clothes with a head like Waterloo Station and the maid screaming that my brother was dead. What more do you need?" Poirot moved forward, selected a cigar from the cedar box on the table, and clipped it with the Colonel's own silver cutter. "I need truth, monsieur. You quarreled, yes. You threatened, yes. You drank enough whiskey to float a gunboat, certainly. But you did not kill. Observe." He lit the cigar with a spill from the fire, puffed delicately, and continued. "The wound was delivered by a right-handed person standing above the seated victim. You are left-handed, Colonel. Your regimental records confirm it, and I observed you sign the police ledger with your left hand this morning. A small thing, perhaps, but the little things are everything." The Colonel stared at his left hand as though it belonged to a stranger. "By God," he muttered, "so I didn't. But then who the devil did?" "That is what we shall discover." Poirot drew closer, voice dropping to the confidential murmur that had broken stronger men than Colonel Armitage. "Tell me about Burma in 1911, the rising at Myitkyina, the temple of the Jade Princess, the ornament itself." The Colonel's face darkened with memories older than grief. "Reggie was my junior by 5 years, always jealous, always scheming. When the dacoits rose, we were cut off for 3 weeks. Men died of fever, of dysentery, of despair. Reggie found the temple, or said he did, and came back with that cursed jewel. Claimed a dying princess, gave it to him for safekeeping. Lies. He stole it while the priests were slaughtered. I told him to leave it, told him the men would never forgive looting a holy place, but Reggie laughed. Said finders keepers. Then when young Green, Decent lad, only 24, was caught with a few silver bowls in his kit. Reggie had him court-martialed and shot the evidence straight to the political officer. Green hanged himself in Rangoon jail to escape the firing squad. Reggie kept the jade tree and called it his luck. And the dagger? Poirot asked softly. Presentation piece to Green before the disgrace. Jade hilt, Burmese work. Reggie took that too, mounted it above the mantel like a hunting trophy. God, the vanity of the man. Poirot nodded slowly, smoke wreathing his head like incense. So the past returns, Colonel, dressed in Christmas green and red. Someone in this house remembers 1911 as clearly as you do. Someone who loved Captain Green, perhaps, or hated your brother enough to wait 25 years for justice. The Colonel poured another whiskey with a steadier hand. There's more, he said hoarsely. Reggie was writing his memoirs. Chapter 12 was to be the truth about me at Kina. He showed me the draft last week. Names, dates, the whole filthy story. My name chief among the cowards, he said. Said he'd ruin me unless I paid him 50,000 to suppress it. I haven't 50 pence. Lavinia has debts that would sink the Navy. He knew that. He enjoyed it. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And the new will? Cutting me out entirely, leaving everything to some museum in Burma as reparation. The ornament to go with it. Lavinia heard him dictate the codicil to that girl. What's her name, Green? Only yesterday. She came storming into my room in floods of tears. Said we'd be in the workhouse by Easter. A silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of Lavinia's voice raised in shrill altercation with Inspector Marsh somewhere down the corridor. Poirot finished his cigar, dropped the stub neatly into the hearth, and turned to go. You did not kill your brother, Colonel, he said quietly. But you have given me something almost as valuable. You have given me motive, old, cold, and patient as the snow outside. And motive, monsieur, is the seed from which murder grows. As he reached the door, the Colonel spoke again, almost inaudibly. Find who did it, Monsieur Poirot. Find them and hang them high. Reggie was a swine, but he was my brother. Poirot paused, hand on the knob. Justice, Colonel, is sometimes more terrible than vengeance. Pray that you never learn the difference. He slipped out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the Colonel alone with the ghosts of tigers and the long, bitter echo of a war that had never truly ended. Chapter 5. The Major's Secret. Major Desmond Blake stood alone on the frozen terrace, staring across the white lawns toward Nothium, dark line of beaches as though somewhere beyond them lay the jungle he had never truly left. The wind had dropped. The air was so cold it seemed to burn the lungs, and every breath hung for a moment in a small white cloud before vanishing. He wore no coat, only the old regimental sweater with its faded Burma shoulder flash, and the scar along his jaw stood out livid against skin that had lost every trace of tropical bronze. When Poirot appeared beside him, silent as a cat despite the crunch of snow under his galoshes, the Major did not start. He had heard the approach long before the little Belgian reached the balustrade. You move quietly for a civilian, Monsieur Poirot, Blake said without turning. One might almost think you had patrolled a perimeter in the dark. I have patrolled many things in the dark, mon major, Poirot replied, drawing his coat tighter. At the moment I patrol the edges of a murder, and your name, I think, is written somewhere upon the map. Blake's mouth twisted. Then arrest me and be done with it. I have no taste for games. Games? No. But truth, yes, truth has a taste. Bitter sometimes, like quinine. Tell me about Captain Anthony Green. The Major's hand tightened on the stone coping until the knuckles blanched. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant creak of branches under their weight of snow. Tony Green was the best of us, Blake said at last, voice low and hard. 24 years old, fresh from Sandhurst, believed in king, empire, and the honesty of his commanding officer. When the dacoits trapped us at Mayatkina, he held the north wall with 12 men and a broken Lewis gun until we could break out. Saved all our lives. Then Armitage found the temple, ordered it cleared. The priests were old men. They tried to protect their shrine. Armitage shot the high priest himself, took the jade ornament, and laughed. Tony Green saw it all. When we got back to Rangoon, he threatened to report the looting. Armitage produced a forged order, claimed Green had stolen silver from the temple himself. Court-martial followed in 48 hours. Tony hanged himself in his cell the night before sentence was carried out. Left a letter saying he would rather die than live dishonored. Armitage kept the letter, kept the dagger too, kept everything. Poirot listened without movement, the cold forgotten. And you, Major? You have carried this knowledge for 25 years. I carried it through Gallipoli, through Mesopotamia, through every damned mess from here to Mandalay. When I retired last year, I swore I would see the ornament returned to the temple or destroyed. I wrote to Armitage. He invited me for Christmas, said we would talk. I came. You arrived yesterday afternoon. You played bridge with Madame Lavinia until 2 o'clock. Then, Blake turned at last. His eyes were the flat gray of a man who has looked too long at death. Then I walked. Couldn't sleep. The house was quiet. I went down to the library. The door was unlocked, oddly. Armitage was at his desk, writing. He looked up and smiled the same damned smile he wore the day Tony died. Said he had decided to make full confession in his memoirs after all, but that the ornament would stay in England. Said it was his by right of conquest. I told him conquest was theft with a louder voice. He laughed. I left before I struck him. Poirot's gaze was very steady. You left by the garden door? Yes. And stood beneath the library windows? Blake hesitated a fraction too long. I smoked a cigarette. The snow was already deep. Poirot produced from his pocket a scrap of khaki wool, no larger than a sixpence. This was caught on a thorn directly beneath the center window. Khaki, the exact shade of your regimental sweater. Yet when I examined the snow beneath that window this morning, the surface was unbroken except for a shallow depression no more than an inch deep, as though someone had stood there after the snow had almost ceased, perhaps at 4 o'clock or later. Blake looked at the scrap of wool as though it were a death warrant. I went back, he admitted at last. Couldn't sleep, walked again, stood there a long time. Thought about breaking the window, taking the dagger, cutting his throat with the same blade that had ruined Tony Green. But the window was fastened. I am not a housebreaker, Monsieur Poirot. In the end, I did nothing. Went back to bed. Heard nothing, saw nothing. When the maid screamed at 6:30, I thought at first it was a dream. Poirot slipped the wool back into his pocket. You are a man of honor, Major. Honor is inconvenient, but it is also unmistakable. You did not kill Sir Reginald. Blake's head came up sharply. Then who did? That is what the little gray cells are beginning to tell me, Poirot said softly. Someone who knew every detail of that old betrayal. Someone who waited patiently for the one night when the house would be full, the snow would fall, and the ornament would be taken from its case by Sir Reginald's own hand. Someone who needed no ladder, no broken window, because Sir Reginald himself opened the door and welcomed his murderer with trust. Blake stared at him. Trust? Armitage trusted no one. Yet he did, Poirot said. Once, long ago, and the debt of that trust has been settled at last in blood and rubies. He turned to go, then paused. One more thing, Major. The scent of frangipani in the library, strong near the desk, faint by the door. You notice it? Blake frowned. Temple incense. The priests at Myatkina burned it. Tony Green's mother was Burmese. She sent him a bottle every birthday. He used to wear it for luck. Poirot's eyes gleamed like winter stars. Précisément. Luck has run out for someone in this house, Major, and very soon now the snow will begin to melt, and all things hidden will be revealed. Hilao Jam left Blake on the terrace staring after him, the wind stirring the faded ribbons on an old campaign medal, while behind the tall windows of Winterbourne Manor the shadows lengthened, and the past pressed closer with every falling flake. Chapter 6. The Nephew's Debt. Giles Armitage was discovered at 5 o'clock in the billiard room, sprawled across the table as though he had decided to become part of the green baize landscape, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers and an empty brandy bottle rolling gently back and forth with the motion of his breathing. The room smelled of smoke, spirits, and the particular sour desperation that clings to young men who have lost more than money. When Poirot entered, followed by a disapproving Inspector Marsh, Giles opened one eye, regarded them blearily, and managed a crooked smile that might have been charming on a better day or a better man. "Ah, the famous Poirot," he drawled, pushing himself upright with the exaggerated care of the thoroughly drunk. "Come to measure me for the noose, have you? Take your time. I'm told the drop is calculated by weight, and I've lost 2 stones since White sent their last little reminder." Poirot regarded him with the detached sympathy he might accord a laboratory specimen. "Monsieur, you announce your ruin with the enthusiasm of a man ordering champagne. Yet ruin is not always fatal, whereas murder most certainly is. Tell me about the £14,000. Giles laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 14,412, actually, plus interest that breeds faster than rabbits. My uncle was going to settle it, dear generous Uncle Reggie. Said if I played the dutiful nephew over Christmas, kept my mouth shut about his memoirs, and smiled nicely at the frightful Lavinia, he would write a check on Boxing Day that would buy me a new life in Kenya, or Monte Carlo, or wherever bankrupt younger sons go to die. Then yesterday he changed his mind. Said I was a disgrace, a parasite, a blot on the family escutcheon. Said he was cutting me out of the will entirely and giving the whole shooting match to some museum in Rangoon. Rather a shock, as you may imagine. He reached for the brandy bottle, found it empty, and shrugged philosophically. So there it is. Motive as broad as Piccadilly, an opportunity? Well, I was blotto by 11, carried upstairs by the fair Felicity. Ask her, she'll tell you I was singing Mad Dogs and Englishmen in 3 keys at once. Couldn't have stabbed a sweet pudding, let alone an uncle. Poirot's gaze traveled slowly over the young man, the tremor in the manicured hands, the bloodshot eyes, the faint bruise on the left cheekbone where someone had struck him recently and hard. You quarreled with Sir Reginald after dinner. The footman heard you threaten to kill him if he did not pay your debts. Threats are cheap, Giles said lightly, especially after the port has gone, round twice. I threaten to kill my bookmaker every time he sends a bill. Never followed through yet. Poirot moved closer, voice dropping to the silken murmur that had broken stronger defenses than Giles Armitage possessed. And the ornament? £50,000 melted down, you said yesterday. Enough to buy a cattle ranch in Kenya and a great many new beginnings. Giles's smile faltered for the first time. I'm not a thief, Monsieur Poirot. I'm a gambler. There's a difference. Thieves work for their money. Yet someone took the ornament from its case, wrapped it in black silk, and hung it at the top of the Christmas tree like a macabre decoration. Someone who knew the house, knew the ritual, knew exactly where Sir Reginald kept the key in his waistcoat pocket. Giles lit another cigarette with fingers that shook. Not me. I can't climb library steps sober, let alone drunk. And I certainly didn't wrap the damn thing in black silk. Where would I find black silk at midnight? Ask Felicity. She put me to bed, tucked me in, and turned the key in the lock so I wouldn't wander. Maternal instinct, I suppose. Poirot's eyebrows rose. She locked you in? Figure of speech, the key was on my side, but I was dead to the world. Didn't stir until the maid started screaming at 6:30 and I discovered I had the devil's own headache and an uncle with a dagger in his ribs. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then turned to Inspector Marsh. You searched Mr. Armitage's room? Top to bottom, nothing. No jewel, no black silk, no blood-stained clothing. Only a great many unpaid bills and a revolver he swears is for protection against duns. Giles gave a cracked laugh. Protection. My dear Inspector, if I owned a revolver worth a damn, I'd have pawned it months ago. Poirot was silent, turning something over in his mind. At last he spoke, almost gently. You are a young man who has made a mess of life, monsieur, but you did not make this particular mess. Someone else climbed those library steps in the dark. Someone else pressed the dagger home. Someone else needed the ornament not for money, but for memory. Giles looked at him then, really looked, and for an instant the mask slipped and Poirot saw raw fear beneath the brandy and bravado. Then God help them, he whispered, because if it wasn't me and it wasn't the Colonel and it wasn't old Blake with his honor and his ghosts, then it was one of the women. And women, Monsieur Poirot, are quite terrifying when they decide to be lethal. He reached for a fresh bottle, found it miraculously unopened, and raised it in a mocking toast. To the fair sex, he said, may they have mercy on us all. Poirot watched him drink, then turned away. As he reached the door, Giles called after him, voice suddenly sober. Find who did it, Monsieur Poirot. Find them quickly. Because whoever killed my uncle enjoyed it. You can smell it in the library still, cold satisfaction like frost on steel. And people who enjoy killing once very seldom stop at one. Poirot paused on the threshold, hand on the frame. You are wiser than you pretend, monsieur. And more afraid. Fear is healthy. It keeps the little gray cells alert. He left Giles alone with the green baize and the ticking of the billiard room clock, a young man who had gambled everything and lost, yet who would live to gamble again because murder for once had passed him by in the dark. Chapter 7. The Secretary's Tears. At 11 o'clock that night, the house had fallen into the uneasy hush that follows violent death. Fires burned low, clocks struck the hour and were answered by silence, and every creak of the old timbers sounded like a footstep in the corridor. Poirot, unable to sleep, descended the great staircase wrapped in a dressing gown of quilted purple silk and carrying a small electric torch whose beam slid over suits of armor and ancestral portraits like a wary cat. He had intended to revisit the library, to stand once more where Sir Reginald had died and let the little gray cells work undisturbed. But when he reached the half-open drawing-room door, he stopped, for a thread of light showed beneath it, and a faint sound, half sob, half sigh, drifted out into the dark. Inside, a single lamp burned beside the Christmas tree. Felicity Green stood beneath the tall green branches, one hand resting on the library ladder as though she might climb again to the place where the jade ornament had hung until that afternoon. She wore a dark dressing gown, her hair loose upon her shoulders, and the lamplight turned her pale face to ivory and her eyes to wet jet. She did not hear Poirot at first. She was staring upward at the empty apex of the tree, and tears slid down her cheeks without sound or shame. Poirot switched off his torch and entered softly, closing the door behind him. She started then, dashing the tears away with the heel of her hand, but it was too late. He had seen. Forgive the intrusion, mademoiselle, he said gently. But grief at midnight is a private thing, and I would not have disturbed it had I known. Yet perhaps it is well that I am here. Tears, like blood, leave traces that are difficult to hide. She tried to speak, failed, and pressed both hands to her mouth as though to hold back a cry. Poirot moved closer, not touching her, only standing where the lamplight caught the compassion in his eyes. "You climb those steps in your dreams, perhaps?" he asked. "You see again the moment when you hung the ornament there, wrapped in black silk so that no light should catch the rubies until morning. You see Sir Reginald seated at his desk, trusting, unsuspecting, and you feel again the weight of the dagger in your hand. Is it not so?" Her breath came ragged. "Stop," she whispered, "and please stop." "I will stop when the truth is finished with us both," Poirot said. "You are the daughter of Captain Anthony Green, are you not? The child he never saw, born in Rangoon 3 months after he hanged himself in his cell. Your mother brought you to England when you were 5, changed your name, told everyone your father had died of fever, but you knew. You always knew." Felicity's knees gave way. She sank onto the bottom step of the ladder and buried her face in her hands. Poirot remained standing, small and implacable and infinitely sad. "When you were 21, he continued quietly, you discovered the truth in your mother's papers after she died. You learned that the man who had destroyed your father lived at Winterbourne Manor, that he kept the dagger that had been your father's gift, that every Christmas he hung the stolen jade ornament at the top of his tree as though it were a trophy of war. You took a post as his secretary under your mother's maiden name. You waited. You learned his habits, his rages, his fears. And when he began to write his memoirs, when he threatened to expose the colonel, to bequeath the ornament to a museum, to rewrite history so that your father remained forever a thief, you understood that the moment had come." She lifted her head then, and the tears had stopped. Her face was calm, almost serene, the way a martyr's must look when the flames are lit. "He laughed at me," she said, voice steady now. "That last evening, I begged him on my knees to tell the truth in his book, to clear my father's name. He laughed and said some secrets were worth more than rubies and that my father had been a fool and a thief and always would be. Then he dismissed me after 2 years of fetching his tea and taking his letters and listening to him boast about Burma as though he had been a hero instead of a murderer. I went to my room. I waited until the house was quiet. Then I put on my dark dressing gown, took the duplicate key I had cut months before from Mrs. Dalrymple's bunch while she napped, and went down the servants' stair. Poirot listened without moving, without breathing it seemed. He was overjoyed to see me, she went on, a terrible wonder in her voice. He thought I had come to offer myself, anything to keep the secret safe. He unlocked the glass case himself, took out the ornament, held it up to the firelight so the rubies blazed. He said, "Here, my dear, is the price of silence." I took it from his hand, and then I took the dagger from the wall, my father's dagger, and I gave him the death he had given my father, only quicker. She rose slowly as though every bone ached. I meant to escape with the ornament, to send it back to the temple anonymously. But when I reached the hall, I saw the tree bare at the top, waiting for tomorrow's ceremony, and I thought, let him hang it himself one last time through me. So I climbed the ladder. I wrapped it in the black silk scarf I wore against the cold. I tied it with the golden cord I had, already cut. And when I came down, I was calm. I returned to the library, pressed the cord into his hand so it would look like robbery, blotted the single drop of blood on the rug with my scarf, and burned the scarf in the fire. Then I went back to bed. I slept better than I have slept in years. Poirot regarded her for a long moment, the lamp between them throwing long shadows across the tree and the wrapped presents no one would open tomorrow. "You planned everything," he said at last, "except the snow. The snow that kept us all prisoners, that gave Poirot time to see what others would have missed. You are very clever, mademoiselle, and very brave and very wrong. Justice is not vengeance, and murder remains murder even when the victim deserved to die 1,000 times. Felicity Green looked at him then, and for the first time she smiled, small, sad, accepting. "I know," she said simply. "I knew when I drove the dagger home. But my father has slept quietly at last, and that is worth a rope." From the doorway came the quiet tread of Inspector Marsh and two constables. Poirot had summoned them with a note delivered by the night footman an hour earlier. Felicity did not resist when they took her arms. She only turned once, looked up at the dark top of the Christmas tree and whispered something in Burmese that Poirot, who understood, translated silently to himself. "May the wheel turn, and the debt be paid." As they led her away, the lamp flickered in a sudden draught and went out, leaving only the faint glow of the dying fire and the scent of frangipani lingering like a blessing or a curse beneath the branches of a tree that would never now receive its crown. Chapter 8. The Reconstruction. Christmas Eve arrived pale and iron cold, the sky the color of old pewter, the snow lying so deep that the tops of the gateposts had vanished, and the world beyond the park seemed to have been erased. Inside Winterbourne Manor, the household gathered in the library at Poirot's quiet insistence. The colonel rigid with whiskey and dread, Lavinia swathed in black lace and smelling of sal volatile, Major Blake standing to attention as though on parade, Giles pale but sober. Mrs. Dalrymple and the servants ranged along the wall like mourners at a funeral that had not yet begun. The body of Sir Reginald had been removed at dawn, yet the chalk outline remained upon the Persian rug, and the dagger's empty place above the mantel gaped like a missing tooth. The library ladder had been brought from the hall and set exactly where it had stood 2 nights earlier. The jade ornament, wrapped again in black silk, rested upon the desk beside the open memoirs. Poirot entered last, small and immaculate in his black town coat and white waistcoat, the ribbon of the Légion d'honneur a splash of blood against his lapel. He closed the door with a soft click that sounded in the hush, like the closing of a coffin lid. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice silky and inexorable. "We are met to witness the death of Sir Reginald Armitage once more, not in blood this time, but in truth. For 2 days I have listened to your stories, examined your alibis, measured your hatreds. Each of you had reason to wish him dead. Each of you, I think, has prayed at some silent hour that he might die. Yet only one of you crossed the narrow frontier between prayer and action." He moved to the desk, touched the open pages of the memoir with a gloved finger. Sir Reginald was writing the chapter he called The Jade Princess. He intended to confess everything: the looting of the temple, the murder of the priests, the ruin of Captain Anthony Green. But confession for Sir Reginald was another weapon. He would ruin his brother the colonel, humiliate Major Blake, leave his fortune to a museum, and keep the ornament as a monument to his own vanity. He believed himself untouchable. That was his final mistake. Poirot lifted the jade ornament, let the black silk fall away so that the rubies blazed in the firelight. "This little tree has caused more suffering than any forest. Stolen in 1911, it has hung here every Christmas since, a trophy and a curse. On the night of the 23rd, Sir Reginald took it from its case himself, with his own key, with his own hand, because the person he trusted most in this house had come to him with tears and pleading. That person stood here." He positioned himself beside the chair, holding the ornament while Sir Reginald turned to lock the case again. 1 step, 2 steps, and the dagger, Captain Green's own dagger, was lifted from the wall. The blow was struck downward with precision and with love. Love turned inside out is the sharpest blade of all. Colonel Armitage made a choking sound. Lavinia began to weep theatrically. Major Blake stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Giles lit a cigarette with fingers that no longer shook. Poirot climbed the library steps slowly, the ornament cradled in his hands. The murderer intended to escape with the jewel to return it anonymously to the temple in Burma. but in the hall stood the Christmas tree waiting for its crown. And the murderer thought, "Let him hang it one last time through me." So the ladder was wheeled in silently, the ornament wrapped in the black silk scarf worn against the cold, the golden cord tied in a perfect bow. Then the cord was cut, one piece pressed into the dead man's hand to simulate robbery. The scarf burned in the fire, and the murderer returned to bed believing the snow would cover every trace. He reached the top of the ladder, held the ornament high so that every ruby caught the light like a drop of frozen blood. Yet the snow betrayed her. The snow kept us all here, gave Poirot time to see what haste and grief had hidden. The duplicate key cut from Mrs. Dalrymple's bunch. The thread of black silk caught in the long gallery. The faint scent of frangipani, the perfume of a Burmese mother worn by an English daughter. The perfect fingerprints upon the golden cord because no murderer thinks to wear gloves when hanging a Christmas decoration. He looked down directly at Felicity Green, who stood between two constables, pale and straight and unafraid. "Mademoiselle Felicity Green, you killed Sir Reginald Armitage with the same dagger that had destroyed your father 25 years earlier. You gave him the death he denied, Captain Green, swift instead of slow. You believed you acted for justice, but justice belongs to the law, and the law now claims you." Felicity inclined her head the smallest movement. "I regret nothing," she said clearly. "My father sleeps at last." Major Blake made a strangled sound and took one step forward, then stopped as though an invisible wall held him back. Colonel Armitage buried his face in his hands. Lavinia's weeping ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Giles dropped his cigarette into a flower vase and did not bother to watch it die. Poirot descended the ladder with care, laid the ornament upon the desk, and turned to Inspector Marsh. "It is finished," he said simply. Marsh snapped the handcuffs onto Felicity's wrists. She did not flinch. As they led her past the Christmas tree in the hall, she paused for a single heartbeat, looked up at the bare apex and smiled, a small, serene smile that belonged to a girl who had never existed and to a woman who would never exist again. Poirot watched her go, then turned back to the silent room. "Joyeux Noël," he murmured to no one in particular, and the words fell into the hush like a single drop of blood into untouched snow. Chapter 9. The Ornament Restored. The library clock struck 4 on Christmas Eve as Felicity Green was led away, the sound falling heavy and slow through the house like the tolling of a funeral bell that had waited 25 years to ring. Snow had begun again, soft and relentless, drifting past the tall windows in curtains of white that blurred the world beyond into merciful oblivion. The constable's boots crunched across the gravel, then were muffled as the police car turned down the drive, red tail light flickering once before it vanished into the storm. Inside, the remaining occupants of Winterbourne Manor stood frozen in their separate silences, Colonel Armitage staring at the empty mantel where the dagger had hung, Lavinia twisting her diamond bracelet until the skin beneath was raw, Major Blake rigid by the fireplace, Giles leaning against the doorframe with the exhausted relief of a man who has watched the hangman pass him by. Poirot remained beside the desk, the jade ornament before him catching the firelight in sullen pulses of green and crimson. He touched it once, almost reverently, then lifted the black silk that had wrapped it and let it fall through his fingers like dark water. "It is finished," he said again quietly. But this time the words carried the weight of an epitaph. The wheel has turned full circle. A theft in a Burmese temple in 1911 has been paid for in English blood in 1935. Captain Anthony Green is avenged. Sir Reginald Armitage is dead, and a daughter who never knew her father has given her life for his memory. Major Blake found his voice first, hoarse and cracked. "She was 25 years old, Poirot. 25. She should have had a life. She chose, Poirot replied not unkindly. She chose long ago when she learned the truth and took service in this house under a false name. Every morning for 2 years she brought Sir Reginald his tea, typed his letters, listened to him boast of conquests that were lies. Every Christmas she watched him hang this ornament at the top of the tree and smile. Patience, mon major, can be the deadliest weapon of all. Colonel Armitage lifted his head. His eyes were red but dry. Will they hang her? Poirot's gaze rested on him for a long moment. In England, yes, a woman may still hang, but there will be much talk of provocation, of 25 years of grief, of a father driven to suicide by a wicked man. Perhaps the jury will pity. Perhaps the Home Secretary will listen. Perhaps in the end she will live, in prison but alive. We shall see. Justice is not always blind, sometimes she merely closes one eye. Lavinia gave a high, nervous laugh that broke in the middle. All this for a bauble, a nasty little heathen thing. Reggie should have melted it down years ago. At that, Major Blake moved, swift as a striking snake, and for an instant Poirot thought he would strike her. But he only picked up the ornament, cradling it in both hands as though it were a child. It belongs to the temple of the Jade Princess at Myitkyina, he said. The priests still light incense for the souls of those who died defending it. I will take it back. I will tell them what happened here, and I will tell them that the daughter of Anthony Green has paid the price they never could. He looked at Poirot then, and something passed between the two men, an understanding older than words, forged in different wars but tempered by the same iron. You have my word, Blake continued. It leaves England with me tomorrow. The curse ends tonight. Colonel Armitage rose unsteadily. Take it with my blessing. Take the dagger too if the police will release it. Let the whole damned business be buried in Burmese soil where it belongs. Giles pushed himself away from the doorframe. And the rest of us? What happens to the living? Poirot regarded him with a faint, tired smile. You, monsieur, will inherit what is left, the house, the debts, the memories. You will sell what you must, pay what you can, and perhaps, just perhaps, learn that there are worse things than poverty. Madame Lavinia will discover that diamonds are cold comfort when there is no one left to envy them. The colonel will drink less whiskey and remember that he still has a brother's grave to tend. And Major Blake will sail east with a jade tree in his luggage and a ghost walking beside him all the way to Rangoon. He turned to the fireplace, picked up the poker and stirred the embers until they flared, throwing long shadows across the chalk outline on the rug. As for Hercule Poirot, he will take the next train south, drink chocolate that is not made by an English cook, and spend what remains of Christmas in a country where murder is not served with the plum pudding. Mrs. Dalrymple, who had stood silent throughout, stepped forward, eyes bright with unshed tears. Will there be a tree, sir? For the servants, I mean. The children in the village were promised. Poirot's smile was sudden and genuine. But of course, madame, a Christmas tree must have its crown. Let the village children come tomorrow. Let them hang colored paper and candles and gingerbread. Let them sing. The house has known enough darkness. He lifted the jade ornament one last time, turned it so the rubies blazed like small, fierce hearts, then handed it to Major Blake. Restore it, he said simply. Restore everything that can be restored. Blake took it, wrapping it carefully in the black silk that had once hidden murder and now carried absolution. He bowed, not to Poirot but to the thing in his hands, then turned and left the room without another word. They heard his footsteps on the stairs, steady and military, going up to pack for a journey that would begin at dawn and end half a world away. The fire settled into glowing ashes. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and forgiving, covering the tracks of police cars, of grief, of a young woman who had killed for love and would pay for it with years or with her life. Inside, the library smelled faintly of frangipani and colder things. Poirot drew on his gloves, adjusted his scarf, and walked to the door. On the threshold, he paused and looked back once at the empty space above the mantel, at the chalk outline slowly being erased by a footman's broom, at the 4 survivors who would carry Winterbourne Manor forward into a future none of them had expected. "Joyeux Noël," he said again softly. And this time, no one laughed. Chapter 10. Little Grey Cells at Christmas. The last train south left Oxford at 6:20 on Christmas morning, steam billowing white against a sky the color of tarnished silver. And Hercule Poirot sat alone in a first-class compartment that smelled faintly of coal smoke and warm velvet. Outside, the frozen fields slipped past like pages of an old, unhappy book being turned and closed forever. He had said his farewells at Winterbourne Manor with the neat precision he brought to everything. A bow to Mrs. Dalrymple and a murmured promise that the village children would have their tree. A firm handshake for Major Blake, who stood on the steps clutching a small leather case that held more sorrow than jade. A courteous nod to Colonel Armitage, who looked suddenly old and uncertain without his brother to hate. A cool inclination of the head to Lavinia, who was already calculating the value of mourning jewelry. And finally to Giles, a single sentence delivered in the hall beneath the half-decorated spruce. "You have been given a second chance, monsieur. Do not waste it on cards." Giles had managed a crooked smile and the ghost of a salute. "I'll try roulette instead." Poirot had allowed himself the faintest twitch of the mustache before turning away. Now, settled in his corner with a cup of thick, sweet chocolate provided by the restaurant car, he permitted the little gray cells to review the case one final time, the way a virtuoso plays a favorite sonata softly after the concert is over. The pattern had been there from the beginning, woven tight as the golden cord. A locked room that was never truly locked. A jewel stolen yet returned to its ceremonial place. A murder committed not in rage but in a terrible, icy calm. Every suspect had paraded motive like a banner. The Colonel's ruin, Lavinia's greed, Blake's honor, Giles's desperation. Yet only one had carried the past in her very blood. Felicity Green. He saw her still, standing between the constables, small and straight as a Burmese temple dagger, the lamplight catching the tears she no longer bothered to hide. She had planned for everything except the snow, except the little Belgian with the ridiculous mustaches who noticed the scent of frangipani and the absence of gloves on a midnight climb. She had killed cleanly, cleverly, and, Poirot admitted to himself justly in the oldest sense of that difficult word. The English law would not agree, of course. The rope, or at best a lifetime in gray prison dress, awaited her. Yet somewhere in Burma an old priest would light incense before an empty shrine and feel, without knowing why, that balance had been restored. Poirot sipped his chocolate and gazed at the frost flowers on the window. He thought of Captain Anthony Green, 24 years old, swinging from a rope in Rangoon jail because honor left him no other door. He thought of Sir Reginald laughing as he mounted the stolen ornament year after year, turning grief into glitter. And he thought of a girl who had served tea and taken dictation for 2 silent years, waiting for the single night when the snow would fall thick enough to muffle footsteps and conscience alike. "It is not perfect justice," he murmured to the empty compartment. "It is only the least imperfect thing we mortals have devised." The train slowed for a signal, steam hissing like a kettle. Somewhere ahead lay London, then the boat train to Dover, then the sunshine of the Riviera where no murder had been arranged for him this Christmas. He found himself almost regretting it. Almost. He took from his pocket a small object wrapped in tissue, the broken length of golden cord that had lain in Sir Reginald's dead fingers. Under the microscope at Scotland Yard, it had yielded 3 perfect fingerprints and a trace of frangipani oil. Evidence, condemnation. Yet Poirot had asked Inspector Marsh for this one fragment, and Marsh, understanding something Poirot left unsaid, had handed it over without question. Poirot turned the cord in his gloved fingers, then opened the window a careful inch. The cold rushed in, sharp as forgiveness. He let the cord fall. It fluttered once, a brief glint of gold against the endless white, and was gone, swallowed by the snow, erased as completely as the footprints that had never been. "Thus far," he said softly, "and no further." He closed the window, finished his chocolate, and drew his traveling rug about him. The train gathered speed again, whistle sounding mournful and clear across the frozen fields. Somewhere behind him a house stood quiet under its burden of snow, its Christmas tree crowned now with paper chains and tinsel stars put up by village children who would never know the full story of the ornament that had come and gone like a dark angel. Ahead lay warmth and light, and the orderly world where Hercule Poirot arranged facts the way other men arranged flowers. He permitted himself one small, satisfied smile. "Next year," he told the reflection in the window, a neat, upright figure with magnificent mustaches, "next year we spend Christmas in Egypt. Even the Sphinx, one feels, has fewer secrets than an English country house in the snow." The train rushed on, carrying him south through the whitening dark, and behind it the golden cord lay buried and harmless at last, while far away across the sea a jade tree began its long journey home on a slow boat to Rangoon, and a girl in a prison van looked out at the falling snow and thought of her father's smile. Somewhere, very faintly, temple bells were already ringing.